Welcome to SDSF Live. Let us know where you're logging on from. I'm Nicole from Texas. SDSF Live is brought to you from the Schwachman-Diamond Syndrome Foundation, providing support to families around the world. We are currently live from Facebook and YouTube. You may comment from both platforms and we'll see it in our feed. This show is public, so make sure you don't tell us anything private that you wouldn't want shared on all over the internet. These shows do serve as a library on YouTube, so you could access them later on, and YouTube will translate them into your native language. Hi, Michelle. How you doing?
Hi, Nicole. I'm doing fantastic. I'm Michelle. I'm all the way up in very cold Michigan. And I'm really excited to be back. I feel like we've been kind of on again, off again. It's been like cold, wanted to bundle up.
Nice holiday break. It was nice.
It's a nice holiday break. How were your holidays?
Awesome. We went to Disney World. How awesome is that? Amazing.
I love that your kids are young enough to totally you just said Santa wasn't coming till you got home. That was it. That was the end. That was the end.
Them. We just didn't tell them what day it was until we got home.
Exactly. You're just like, we're just gonna ignore the whole calendar. So, ours were interesting. We I think in record time had the tree put up and taken down. Like, we were done. We're like, we're out. This was a nice time, but we're all done.
I'm excited.
Yeah. Next. I'm super excited, not only because it's my sister, and I love my sister very much, but my sister has helped my family personally through so many of our struggles. I have two neurodiverse children who both have very specific needs, and they're very different from each other. So it's not easy at all around my house. And my sister has been my rock through pretty much all of it, even though she lives far away. She used to get Evelyn to try new macaroni shapes by she would get one on the end of her fork and touch it to their nose and then their chin, and they end up with macaroni all over their face by the end of it. She's got a weird bag of tricks, and it's super cool. I love that we have people from Connecticut and California where it's warm, and Texas where it's probably warm, and Missouri where it's not warm. So sorry. It's just cold everywhere.
Thinking about everyone in the Northeast that just got that bomb cyclone. I know everyone's shoveling themselves out today. I hope the kids had fun at least playing in the snow.
It's always interesting when it snows here. Like, we're expecting it, but then we're not expecting it. Be sure that if you have any questions during Sonya's presentation or before or after, type them in the comments, and we might not answer them right away, but we will get to them. Look, another California. Super warm. Super jealous.
California's.
I think at this time, we are gonna welcome our guest tonight. Her name is Sonya Sutherland. She's an occupational therapist, basically out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, sort of, just ish in the general area. And I will let her introduce herself. So you have the floor, Sonya.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sonya Sutherland. I'm an occupational therapist. I work in Kalamazoo County right now. I work for the schools. I've been an OT for 13 years now. I worked in clinics for a few years. Originally I started off in acute care, so I have a lot of background in neurology and like brain injuries and stroke, and so that really gave me a good foundation for kind of when I started working with pediatrics, looking at the sensory system and how all those things connect in your brain. So that's really what we're going to talk a lot about today. So I'm going to bring this up. So you guys can see everything. I can't see you. So if you're making faces at me, I don't know. So we're just going to go over some sensory signs and strategies today. So this is just a basic introduction to the sensory system and what we're talking about. So the first slide is just, what are we talking about when we're talking about sensory? So a lot of times people think about the 5 senses, like your sight, taste, smell, touch, and hearing. But really, when we're talking about sensory processing, we're not just talking about our senses. We're actually talking about what happens to the information when we're bringing it into our body. So sensory processing is the process. So it's really more what happens in our brain than what happens in our eyes and our skin and our nose and that sort of thing. So a little bit different sometimes than what people think. And there are more senses there is more information that we're processing that goes into sensory processing than just those senses. So we do have sight in the auditory, which is the hearing, and the tactile, which is the touch, and the taste and the smell. But we also have something called proprioception, which is that body awareness and where our body is in space. So when I talk about proprioception, we're talking about actually how our joints work. So you have these different bursa and ligaments that go over your joints, and they give your brain feedback and say, okay, my arm is here, my foot is here, I'm standing up, I'm sitting. It's how your body knows where it is in space. So if you close your eyes and you put your hand out to the side, you know your hand is out to the side, even though system, which is movement, where a lot of times we're talking about inner ear, we are also talking about how the brain registers movement. And most of these systems all interact. There aren't any that are by themselves. So again, when we're talking about sensory processing, we're never really just talking about one system. It's always a team effort and a group of systems. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what happens when the information is brought in. So our brains have to sort it. So it needs to decide, is this information important? Is it dangerous? Is it familiar? Is it interesting? Is it boring? Do I need to attend to it now? And so the brain comes up with answers super quickly and then reacts. And so those are the behaviors we see. And this might be a good time for me to also say, so we talk about sensory processing, and I'll typically say like differences. Sometimes I'll say disorder, but I don't like to put it in a negative light because it just isn't. It's not that it's always bad. In certain situations, processing sensory information in a certain way can be beneficial, but for a lot of the society and where we are in life right now, it's not. So I just don't want it to be, I guess, when we're talking about this, like, it's not that it's a disorder, like something is really wrong. It just doesn't fit into how we're living right now. So it's just sometimes a little easier to think about it that way. So I know this is gross. It's a pizza and it has scorpions on it, but I have three metaphors kind of that I use a lot when I'm talking about sensory processing, especially when I'm talking to families. I did birth to 6 for about 7 years. So the first one, I like to explain the sensory system and how our bodies elevate. And we call that like our registration. And so I usually use this analogy of like a snake in the grass. So if we were to open up your front door, I mean, some of you guys are in areas where this may be a thing where you open up the front door and there may be snakes. But so generally, if you open the front door and you walk out, you look down, you see a snake, your brain says, that's dangerous. But then you look down again and you realize it's not a snake, it's a hose. So your frontal lobe now engages and says, it's okay, we're not going to die, it's just a hose. And so maybe for a few minutes afterwards, you're kind of a little rattled, but your system kind of went way up into high alert, into that fight or flight stage. And a lot of times when kids have sensory processing differences, they can't get themselves to come back down. So once that trigger happens, even if they logically know I'm okay, the inside, the motor's running high, they don't have the skills to get themselves back down. So another thing that I like to talk about, we talk about sensory processing. A lot of times we talk about food, and that's why there's pictures of scorpion pizza here. And Michelle has heard this analogy a few times. So when we're talking about taste and even touch and things we're doing with our body, a lot of it is just how we're introduced to it and the number of exposures we have. So a lot of times when you're looking at food, kids will have an overreaction to food or smells or touch. And we need to work slowly in little steps to normalize that. So it would be like, as adults, if we were to go to another country where they eat scorpions or other types of food that we wouldn't think of as typical, and somebody gave you a scorpion on a stick or a scorpion on a pizza, a lot of us would not be willing to eat it, not be willing to put it in our mouth. But the longer we're around that, the hungrier we are, the more we see it, the more our brain says, okay, it's probably not going to kill us. We can kind of acclimate to that, and then our system can say, okay, we can bring that in. We could give that a try. But it's just, so with kids who have the sensory aspects of feeding and tactile defensiveness, a lot of times you're asking them to eat a spider, or you're asking them to eat scorpions. That's how their brain is reacting to it. So you have these overreactions to the wrong macaroni shape, because the part of their brain that says it's fine and generalizes it and says it's okay, it's just macaroni, is seeing a scorpion. It just can't come to terms with it. So we have to work around that and go in little stages. And then the third metaphor I use a lot is, like, I like to explain the sensory system like if you kind of have a filter, and it just gets full. So if you're having a busy day at work, or kids are kind of crazy and you had to go shopping and everything was busy, and you're coming in the front door and you've got stuff in your hands and your phone is ringing and people want to start asking you questions, a lot of us are going to have a hard time coming up with words and how to get things out. And that's because our sensory system is full, it's overloaded. And so things start not working, connections stop being made because we're stuck in this fight or flight loop. And so the systems that we would use to solve our problems kind of short circuit and stop working. So I just want you guys to keep those metaphors in mind as we kind of go through a little bit more of the sensory processing information. So this is a picture of the brain that I stole from the internet and then I scribbled on it. So this is just something I use, and you guys can't see because I'm pointing, but so I'm going to stop pointing now. So the way I like to explain the, maybe you can see with my little pointer on here. Look at me. So information is going to come in a lot of times if you're talking about tactile information, proprioception, things like that. That information is going to come in from the body. Things about sight, taste, hearing, smell, all that's going to come in, through the nerves that run from those areas. So all of that information comes right in here to the amygdala, which is where the fight or flight response is housed. So almost all of our information first gets filtered through that fight or flight response. So that's where the sensory processing kind of gets hung up. Because a lot of times, like if you walk out the door and you see that snake, you get the fight or flight or freeze. There is a freezing aspect, fight, flight, or freeze. You get that response, and then that information gets shoved up here to your frontal lobe where the logic is, and then you look again and it says, okay, that's a snake, and it sends a message back and says, hey, amygdala, you can calm down. It's just a hose. It's not a snake. And so then it can kind of shut off that fight or flight. The problem is when this fight or flight doesn't shut off. And so that's when you get that sensory processing, when the kids are still looking at the food and seeing a spider or a scorpion, or still looking outside and seeing the snake. So this fight or flight response is kicking in a little bit too much and making it hard for the kids to get their body in order. So one thing I do like to be clear about is that sensory processing disorder is not a standalone diagnosis. You are not going to find it in the DSM. It's generally something that's associated with other disorders. I like to kind of use like to say it's kind of like a fever. Like you can have a fever. A fever is a real thing. It goes with a lot of different illnesses. It can be a symptom. It can be a way your body's fighting something. It's not necessarily always bad, but it isn't a standalone diagnosis. You're not going to be diagnosed with a fever, just like you're not really going to be diagnosed with sensory processing disorder. But you'll see it with kids who have ADD, ADHD. Anxiety is a huge comorbid kind of thing with sensory processing concerns. ASD is where most people are the most familiar with sensory processing. Obsessive compulsive disorders, histories of trauma, developmental delays, many other things. And with kids who have been through a lot of medical procedures, you'll see a lot of that sensory processing difficulty, just because it interferes with the what we would typically be able to process through, because a lot of times their movements are limited and they're kind of exposed to a different set of circumstances than other children. So what does sensory processing and reactions look like, and what can we do about them? So it can look like a lot of things. So usually when I'm asking people about their children's sensory responses, or teachers about children's sensory responses, the things I'm talking about are really their reactions. So what I can't tell what their body's doing on the inside. The only signs that we get are the behaviors that happen on the outside. So when you see things that are an extreme overreaction to whatever situation, and it's not because they're hungry or they're tired or their developmental phase, and you see it happening regularly. It may not be predictable. A lot of times it's not, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But you just kind of know, like, something isn't going through the filter, going through that process the way we would expect. And then on the other side of that coin is sometimes there's extreme underreaction. So you see kids that shut down in certain situations, they don't engage, they withdraw, or you think, oh, they're going to be so excited about this, and all of a sudden they're hiding in the corner, or they're under a blanket, or they're sucking on their thumb or hiding behind your leg, that sort of thing. So when we're trying to identify if something is a sensory concern, we're going to look for patterns and triggers. So some sensory processing reactions are consistent. So you're going to see the same trigger every time. So, when we talk about foods, certain types of foods, certain smells, certain things like that, if I put this on their plate, they're going to freak out. Or if there's a loud noise or a siren or some kind of alarm, they're going to freak out. Or they'll never touch fleece, or they're never going to wear jeans. Those kind of tactile defensive things. Those are a little easier to work with because you can see what the trigger is. But most children aren't going to have just one easily identifiable trigger. Most sensory processing reactions are going to be cumulative. So they're going to be the small things that kind of add up. And a lot of times what you'll see is, if there's consistency, it's going to be around the time of day. So they may be going through their routine, and those small things are adding up. And so by the time it gets to 3, 4 o'clock, they're losing it. They can't hold anything else together. And then you also may notice some days are better than others. So when you're thinking about that with children, sometimes everybody wakes up with some stuff already in their filter. Maybe you didn't sleep well, or when you have a kid that's sensory defensive, or has sensory processing concerns, the type of, sometimes sleeping itself can cause some of that sensory overreaction, because you really lose your sense of space in your body awareness while you're sleeping. And so that transition in and out of sleep sometimes can be enough to be something that ends up in the filter for kids. So, all right. So before I go on to that, so I kind of sometimes I talk about the filter, and I feel like maybe I should probably stop and explain that a little bit. So the way I like to explain it is, if we think about, we all just have a filter. Sensory processing is the filter that all of this information is going through as we go through our days. And what will happen is our brain says, like we talked about earlier, like, this is okay. It finds a file for things. It figures out what to do with it. But when you have a sensory processing concern, some things stay in the filter because your body's like, I'm not sure what to do with this. So it just leaves it there. And then you get too many things in that filter, and that's when you're going to have those stronger reactions that are disruptive, or that interfere with, learning or having a good time, or just your child being able to eat. And so that's where you see those small things adding up. And that's when I say, like, when they wake up and they already have things in their filter, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So when you have kids that have those specific reactions, like we kind of broke it up in the last slide or so, the way we would work on those is so if you have like a concern with something tactile or something with food, we're going to go through those teeny tiny exposures. Maybe we look at the thing. I mean, some kids can't even look at a food or look at a certain type of fabric without gagging, like just seeing it or just smelling it or just thinking about it. So you start there with the littlest, tiniest thing. The very last thing we would ever ask a kid to do is swallow some food. Just like the very last thing, you would want someone to do is to ask you to swallow a spider. Even when you think about when you put something in your mouth and you're sure you're not going to like, you hold it right up there, push your tongue up against your teeth, and it's sitting there. So we want to give kids all of those options that if it gets in their mouth and they need to spit it out, they can spit it out, that sort of thing. So you're going to just do those teeny tiny exposures and little steps. If they can't look at it without gagging, they're not going to touch it and they're not going to put it in their mouth. I mean, there's nothing in this world that I look at that makes me gag that I'm going to want to put in my mouth or I'm going to want to touch. So for specific reactions, like I said, when you know those triggers, we're going to work at those little teeny tiny exposures. Another thing we would do is what we call like deep pressure, because that is something we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide too. But deep pressure is something that's kind of universal, and it can prep kids. Like you see the next little dot. So deep pressure is a strategy we've used to prep their body to help empty that filter before they have an exposure to something that we know is going to be reactive for them. And then we practice it, just like we do a lot of things that we know are going to be hard. And specific reactions tend to improve as children become older because their frontal lobe develops. It becomes stronger, those connections. And so they can reason through the situation and then increase their tolerance, or they might have more drive to do that. So that is something that is a benefit as kids get older. Frontal lobe development is very important. And then for those cumulative reactions, which is how we're typically going to see most kids respond, is we want to be consistent and predictable. So we want to, sometimes the thing that is clogging the filter is just the anxiety of not knowing when something is going to happen. So if we know they have to do something that is going to be a trigger or a situation that is usually an issue, we want to be able to prep them for it. And if we can do it on a consistent basis or in a predictable way, so it's at least the element of surprise is then taken away. So we give that frontal lobe a chance to prep the fight or flight loop and say, we don't have to overreact right now. And then there are ways we can kind of regularly empty that filter. And we'll talk about that in, I think, the next slide. And we're going to create some new neural habits. So what happens when we get in a fight or flight loop is it kind of becomes that well-worn path. So our brain goes there first and it keeps going there. And so what we want to do is empty the filter, get ourselves a consistent kind of schedule and behaviors so that we can create new neural habits and get a new pathway kind of worn down so we don't fall into that habit of panicking first and then figuring it out later. And then we just want to prepare and prep for those mini triggers, those little things that we know are going to kind of be a problem. So, going to the grocery store, a lot of times there's a lot of sensory input that just goes into the ceilings are high, the lights are bright, there's lots of people, there's weird beeping sounds, the walls only go halfway up, all the colors were moving fast. So if you know that situation is something that usually doesn't end well, or by the time you get to the car, the kids is totally worn out, we want to kind of prep and practice for those situations. So, that might be a social story, or that might be something where you do some deep pressure, or we do strategies that work for your child before you go into those situations. And then, depending on the age of your child, the self-talk and just letting them talk it out loud. This is scary. Yes, I don't like this light. Saying it out loud is really good for kids, and activates that kind of auditory system and takes some of that loop. It kind of redirects some of that fight or flight loop. Let's see. So sensory and behavior. So really, one thing with sensory processing is it's always associated with a behavior. So sometimes what you see is as we address sensory issues, we think they're going to get better. Maybe they do for like a few days, and then they'll get worse because it's like a person with a type A personality. If they don't have something to do, they're going to find something to do. And our systems are the same way. They're not, you've lived your whole life in a heightened state of awareness. When you start to calm down, it feels weird, so they wind themselves back up. So we want to create that new neural habit so we can get them to come back down and stay down for longer and longer. So we just need to be consistent, try to verbalize some of those inner states and what we're doing, and just don't give up, because, especially if they're younger, they will definitely challenge you. And then when we talk about the pairing of the behavior, is that even when we're meeting kids' sensory needs, sometimes most of the time, those behaviors are still going to be there. So because kids don't know how else to do a thing. So let's say going to the grocery store, once you get to the checkout, they always freak out. Even if they're not overwhelmed anymore, they haven't really ever had the opportunity to learn the right habits and then learn the right things to do when you're sitting in the checkout line. So and that's just kind of a surface level idea. But so you may need additional counseling or therapies or practices, things like that. Kids are definitely going to need the support and a replacement behavior, because if they're not supposed to freak out, what are they supposed to do? And so then when we talk about deep pressure, so generally when we talk about deep pressure, we're talking about moving the joints together. And some people, there are certain programs where when you're taught about joint compression and things like that, it's a compression and a pull. And it's a very specific program. And that's not necessarily something that I want, that I would recommend everybody use without like an OT or somebody, discussing it and understanding really what you're doing. But deep pressure in general is compression and moving the joints together. And it's actually something that works on most mammals. It's not specific to humans. That's why thunder shirts work for dogs. It's just that compression over all of the joints, pushing them together, working on, that bursa and those tendons and those nerves that run through the joint, sends a message to our brain saying we know where we are in space, we're safe. So you can get deep pressure, through squeezes. And so for most kids, especially if they're in the middle of, having some kind of a meltdown, or if you have a kid who's defensive or has had some trauma, a lot of times hands or feet are a good place to start because there's a lot of small bones. And so what I always like to tell people, if you're going to do compression and you're, even if you're hugging or whatever, we want to make sure everything's going in. So the hands, you're not going to squeeze them like this because it kind of separates all those bones. You're going to be using, I had two hands, I'd be going like this, but since I'm doing it on my own hand, you're going to be pushing in. So you want to see those bones come together. And that's the thing that's going to release the chemicals in your brain that says, okay, we're safe, we're okay. And it gives you an opportunity to come in and comfort a child without grabbing them, because a lot of times the grabbing makes kids feel like you're going to make them do something that they don't want to do. Heavy work is something that you can use on a regular basis, and that's just the use of large muscle groups. So jumping, running, pushing, pulling, digging, all of that, if you live someplace with snow, get them out there and shovel, or dig a hole, move some bricks, roll some logs, that sort of thing. And then vestibular and vibration. So vestibular is, the running, the spinning, the rolling. Vibration kind of gives the same type of input sometimes as vestibular, especially if you have like a vibrating toothbrush or a vibrating cushion. A lot of times you'll see kids put it right up on their jaw, right up on their face. and it can just kind of be reassuring. That's usually something that's good to use in the car if you have like a little toy or a vibrating cushion. If you have kids that have reactions in the car, sometimes that's a good strategy. And then organizing activities. So organizing activities are those rhythmic activities like clapping or dancing, or anything that involves left-right coordination, deep breaths, yoga, that sort of thing. It's really hard to say something works for everybody because everybody's system is different. I would say if there's one strategy that works for most people, it would be deep pressure. There are very few kids, I would say only kids with maybe some really significant trauma have had, where deep pressure isn't good for them. So I'm going to leave it up to questions right now because I know that was kind of a lot of information, but I feel like people might have questions more specific to them. So I'll put it back to Michelle. I think I'm putting it back to Michelle.
Amazing.
I'm here. We're
Okay.
here. We're here. It's super interesting because I've heard you tell me these things like a lot over the last 10 years. Like I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh yeah, we're just sitting around the table. Oh, this is normal. This is what I hear. And it's weird to me because I'm very, very privileged in the fact that I get to hear this a lot from you. And my kids have had a way easier time than they would have because they have Aunt Sonya who can tell them these things, who can touch the macaroni to their nose and their cheeks and their chin and their I remember Sonya made it so Evelyn could take a bath. The sound of the water, the feel on her hair. I understood something was wrong, but I never understood how to help her feel okay with it. Like I can empathize with her because I also don't like when the water touches my hair, and then it's
Sonya,
weird. It's super weird, but it was just
the
really
connection
interesting
between the medical trauma and how that becomes sensory processing.
Yeah. So a lot of times, especially when kids have a lot of hospitalizations early on, like my own daughter was like a preemie, you know what I mean? And so, there's a lot of like foot pokes, a lot of needles, IVs, things like that limit movement. And adults are kind of panicky. People don't always think about this, but your heart, it's going to sound like I'm digress. I'm like on a tangent, but I swear it'll wrap back around. So your heart actually gives a lot.
Fully there. We're good. We're good. We'll all come back around eventually.
So you have like an electromagnetic field. I'm not talking like weird mumbo jumbo, but just because our bodies use electricity, like our heart uses electricity to pump. So as adults, when our heart rate is fast, kids can feel that. And so a lot of times kids' heart rates will go to match adults' heart rates. So just the idea of being in the hospital with adults who are tense, a lot of times causes a higher rate of alertness for kids and a habit right off the bat, starting from that, that young age. And if that happens on a regular basis, kids don't have the resources. They don't have the wiring in their brain to say, okay, I'm not in the hospital. I don't need to be freaking out. They just don't have the way to process it. So a lot of times being in those situations over and over again just makes them more sensitive and kind of more highly alert.
So that could be in any kind of traumatic situation, like an abusive situation.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there a way? So we've always made it so Nathan had as much of a choice when we were in the hospital as possible. Do you want an IV in this arm, or a shot in this leg, or do you want to do it in this room or that room? So he could have as much control over it as he physically could, but it still didn't eliminate the poke or the straps or the weird feelings or the sights and senses. Is there, like, we've noticed when we get home from anesthesia or a hospital day, he needs a day or two to just come back down because so much has happened that he's not had enough time to transition to. is there any simple strategies we can use when we're in the hospital or we're at testing or anything like that that we can kind of give them more control and understanding and
I
processing
mean, really,
of what's
the thing
happening?
is cognitively every kid's going to be different. So we can't talking about it and saying it out loud is fine. It's going to help to a certain extent, but the development of that frontal lobe is just going to be what it is for the age of the kid you're working with. There's only so much that part of their brain can do to help them calm down. So what we want to do is cheat and go in the back door and do the strategies, from a sensory perspective, work for your child. So, for Nathan, I know that heavy work piece, that deep pressure, that's going to be the stuff that works for him. So doing that, trying to do it on a regular basis when you're in the hospital, just do feet massages or, that sort of thing regularly to empty that filter, and then talk about when we go home, we'll get back to doing this and blah, blah, blah. Reminding him that the things you're used to are coming and it's going to be okay. And then as soon as you get home, try to get back in that routine as much as you can so that his system can come back down.
You had said that the medical
That's good.
trauma
Yeah,
is
those are
limited
good.
as some of the limited mobility they have. So I know like a lot of our kids get tons of blood work, especially as infants, and they'll just, a lot of them get multiple pokes at one time, and then that's repeated over days. Like
Mhm.
the method a lot of them use is we're all holding them down, and that seems to really trigger them. So that limited mobility really.
Well, yeah, and think about the way touch changes when your child's in the hospital. I'm not trying to be a downer. Like, I know that there's nothing you can do about it because you're doing what's best, and that's okay, but the way we touch kids changes. When they're in the hospital, there's more negative touch and there's less opportunity for that positive touch. So as much as we can, so you'll see kids get really tactily defensive if they've been in the hospital a lot because they don't know, they cannot generalize when good touch is going to happen in what situation or what's good. You know what I mean? They just can't predict it. So the more predictable we can make it, even if you're using pictures in the hospital, even though if your kid is verbal, especially if they're younger, or their cognitive level is lower, just saying like, okay, there's going to be a poke and then we're going to do squeezes and then mom's going to lay with you, or then, this kind of thing is going to happen. So because the visual part of our brain is more immediate than hearing, and it goes a little bit easier to the emotional regulation piece. Sometimes even with kids who are verbal and can understand what you're saying, those pictures are going to be more of a benefit.
Okay. Our kids.
And I don't know that I need to necessarily say this out loud, but if anyone goes to the hospital and they have a child life department, I highly recommend utilizing them. They're so good to come in and remind us when we're already overwhelmed and stressed, like, hey, would you like me to get my iPad, or would you like Buzzy, or they're just full of all these tips and tricks and tools. And I feel like child life is like a psych OT, like a nanny maid all in one. They're just, we call them the green shirts here at DeVos because they all wear green shirts, but they're so good.
And I want to say
Utilize
too,
them if you have that department.
Sorry. About our own, as adults, our own regulation. Probably one of the biggest things you can do is continue to try to touch and make eye contact and try to get your own internal system down. So if you need to take a minute and do yoga and stuff like that, I know there's a lot of stress on parents, but because kids can feel it, like they've done tons of research where they put like the heart rate monitors on the adults and put the heart rate monitors on the kids. And even when the adults are acting fine, when their heart rate is elevated, that elevates the kids. So they may not even know why they feel a certain way. So if you get, you know what I mean, as adults, if we can just take that breath, sometimes that is going to be enough to really change that experience.
I noticed
I don't know if it was you that told me this, or maybe in one of the books I started and stopped reading 5 times, but as an adult, you cannot regulate a child if you are dysregulated. I'm sure it came from you or a book or both, but Justin and I, my husband, have found that so we remind each other of that. If we're at a heightened state of something, we cannot help our child calm down because we're not calm. We can't bring them to a place of calm if we're not there. We know all the words, we know all the tricks, we can pull out the pictures. They're still going to feel that we are tense and angry and mean or sad or whatever we are and not be able to come there. I think that's super huge. So we had a question come in from Jacqueline, a kind of a question. She said, this info is great. Going to use some of this definitely to help, or some of this immediately, sorry, to help my AJ. We have to go to the dentist next week and I'm dreading it. He's 5 and he's almost 5 and on the spectrum. The dentist, we're very thankful we have one that we love and they understand my children, is a very hard place for a lot of our kids to go. What can we help? Are there any tools or tricks we can bring into the dentist?
Well, you definitely want to break down the things that are the most triggering for the dentist. So if you have a kid that is orally defensive and you're going to the dentist, like we're really going to want to, like, so we want to talk to them about, you know, what's going on in their mouth. You definitely want to talk to the dentist, you know, if they have a heightened gag reflex, that sort of thing. So I always would start there because that's going to be like, that's going to immediately go to your fight or flight. I mean, there's nothing you can do. Like your body doesn't want stuff in its mouth because it thinks it's going to choke or you're going to be poisoned and you're going to die. So you have to address that piece first. So like vibration or whatever works for you, suckers, whatever works for your kid to get their mouth ready. But just going through it piece by piece. We're going to get in the car, you know, before we go in, we'll, you know, do these squeezes or we'll do some jumps or we'll listen to this song. And then when we go in, you know, sometimes kids need like earbuds or headphones or sunglasses, whatever it is that are the scariest pieces. Discuss how you're going to address them before you go. So do it in steps, whether you have to draw it out or print out pictures or just talk it through repeatedly a few times. That's the biggest thing, is as much as you can prep their system to at least take away the element of surprise if you can't take away what's about to happen. I know it's not specific, but it's super hard too because every kid is different and different things are going to be triggers and different things work. So.
I think a lot of our kids have trouble sequencing too. I know I hear that come up a lot, the sequence of events. So those pictures and reminding them the sequence of events that's going to happen, that's really good.
Yeah. And, you know, and even
a lot of our kids who are visual, like then with the visual piece added into it, it helps them understand it and see it more.
And even while you're there, you know, bring it in like, okay, we did this piece. And then what's the next piece that's going to happen? Yeah. Just so that, again, getting that surprise.
We had a question. What do you suggest if a child is so overwhelmed they cannot handle touch or talking?
So generally, this is why I say, you know, trying to build in like the emptying that filter on a regular basis. So when a kid is completely overwhelmed, you really, it's at that point, this is the worst analogy, but it's the best one I have. It's like trying to get somebody sober when they're already drunk. Like you just might need to leave them alone and give them a glass of water and let them work it out, make sure they're safe. But really what we can try to do, since we know that sometimes they get to that point, is, you know, every couple of hours or every hour or whatever, introduce the strategies that help empty that filter. So maybe they don't get so overwhelmed. And depending on their age, sometimes like, you know, I'll give them little charts like, okay, if they have, you know, certain favorite characters or favorite dinosaurs, like, you know, I feel like a pterodactyl, and that might be middle, that might be your yellow zone, and T-Rex might be your red zone, you know, helping them figure out how they can understand those things. But sometimes when kids are in the middle of freaking out, you can't touch them, you can't do the thing, you know, vibration is one thing, or a weird sound. Sometimes that'll interrupt it because they're depending on your kid. So you have to know your kid. Vibration is something that, because it has a sound and it has that input and they can control it, they can put it next to them. But you never want to introduce something new in the middle of a meltdown. So anything you're going to try, you want to make sure that you think that you've tried it and it worked in a different situation. And we also have like like I've worked with kids where it's like a certain like a musical toy or something like that. Like we know they like musical toys, so it might not even be a toy they're familiar with, but if it's a song, whatever, and you push it, then they'll be like, it kind of like resets them. So sometimes that can pull them out. And you kind of want to, most of the time, these kind of things will go in these ebbs and flows. So they'll be so wound up, so wound up, so wound up. And then, they get tired. So they start coming down. And then you might go in and try to intervene. They're like, wait, no, I'm mad. Ah! And they're all over the place again. So when you go in, a lot of times I go in backwards. So I will back into a kid as long as I know it's safe. So I might back up to them and squeeze their feet. Or I might back up to them and give them the toy or something that I know that they would want. So that eye contact and that coming in frontal, a lot of times that is just too much, or they think you're going to make them do something, or it's going to be a lot. So hopefully those are ideas that can help.
I just wanted to piggyback on that with the feeling safe part that you had said, is that if they're not at a space to talk, you have to make them safe. For the longest time, we had a big squishy comfy recliner chair up against the wall with Nathan's zones of regulation, where he could physically pick up the Velcro character and put them on green or yellow or red. So without using his words or his voice or his eyes or anything, he could tell us where he was. And then we knew when he because we established this when he was calm, when he was ready to talk, he would be in the yellow, and he could move his person to yellow and say, without saying anything, that he was okay and ready to talk. And if he needed to stop talking, he could pick that up and move it back to red. But he was always in his safe space. We never called it a timeout. We never called it sometimes we would call it a quiet zone, but we almost always called it his safe space. He's now 8 years old, and he's since upgraded it to the back of the chair, and he calls it his wolf den. And he goes in there and he's got his blankets and his fidgets, and he knows he's safe in there. And I know he's safe in there because there's no electrical outlets or glass or anything he could physically put his hands into, because he was a biter, a hitter, all the things. So keeping the kids safe, I think, is a huge, even if you can't get them in control, keep them safe, so then they can move forward however. So we had one last question, or not last, I guess, a question come in from Jessica Alvarez. Suggestions for a kiddo that really struggles with sensory overload but has a difficult time communicating that need. At home, I can pick up on it, really fast, but with a plan to reduce and help, but the school, it's extremely difficult.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if your child has interventions in place at school, if she has a team that's working with her. But I'm sorry, I feel like, because I don't know these kids, I just have to go with my default, which is the more regularly you can put in place whatever things work. So if it's every hour they get deep pressure, or every hour they do some heavy work, or they have 5 minutes with the toy that vibrates, or
I'm sorry, Sonia, who would do the deep pressure? Like one of their aides, or?
I sometimes will teach, depending on the student, we'll teach, like, okay, we want to compress the joints, we want to do that. But I'm the OT, so I might do that with their aides. But what works a lot for deep pressure is a gym mat. So having them go to the gym, they crawl on the mat, because they're usually folded in different levels. So if they need a little bit of pressure, they go on the top. They need a lot of pressure, they get right in the bottom, and they'll just hang out in there. And a lot of times I'll give them work. So they'll be laying with their head out and their arms out, and they'll do their little work, and they're getting their deep pressure, whatever they need.
And the mat's like folded on them.
And they're just in, so nobody's doing anything to them. They come in or out, whatever they need. Also, there are like the weighted vests, the lap belts, those sort of things. I hate putting things in a classroom where the teachers have to take them in and out, because
so they would get a break and go to the gym and hang out inside the mat.
Or, some kids do good if you have like an under layer. So if you have that deep pressure layer, like a swim shirt or an Under Armour shirt, those kind of things, and maybe they take it off in the middle of the day, or so it's just a matter. Sometimes, like, I have one kid that, he's not verbal. He's got a lot going on. And so he gets mad and throws things. The thing that I give him that's available to him in his safe space is a weighted blanket, because you really can't throw it, but it takes so much work for him to pick it up and drag it and try to toss it out the door that by the time he's done, he's cool. Like, so sometimes you just have to be a little,
Yeah.
like, so sometimes it's just a matter of figuring out what we can do on a regular basis. That we can calm down. And sometimes kids can squeeze their own hand if you have a kid that likes brushing or tickling, just what can we do on a regular basis to empty that filter?
You're right. It is like it accumulates through the day, because I know, like with my own son, the administration and the teacher keep saying, like, I don't know, like he was fine, and then something, and it's like, I think that the constant is it's that day it was too much. That his filter didn't get filtered that day, maybe.
Well, and it's almost sad, because then like their frontal lobe is trying really hard. Like it said, okay, guys, fight or flight, calm down. I'm gonna keep trying. And then they get through it and they can do the next thing, and then they're like, no, fight or flight, we're not gonna do that right now. They're having this inner struggle, and then finally it's just like, nope, it's too much. I can't.
Yeah. And these kids get punished a lot.
Yeah.
In school, which is really sad.
That behavior, because all you see is the behavior, and sometimes it looks like a choice. So I spend a lot of time talking to teachers about what is a choice. But I will say this, I always think there is a consequence. You can't take away the consequence, but you can take away like the shame or the other emotional
pieces. I was going to say it creates shame when they feel like they had a choice, when they were really trying hard, it seems like, to keep it together.
I mean, because even when you have an accident, there are consequences. So, you know what I mean? But just sometimes teachers take it so personally that there's that emotional punishment that goes along with it. And that's the part that kind of needs.
And parents too. Yeah, parents would do it too, unfortunately.
We had a question come in from Gina. Our son is constantly tearing the threads out of all of his clothes and socks. And I don't think this is the first SDS parent I've heard this from, because when I first saw the question, I was like, wait a second, that's not Gina. Like, I was thinking it was someone else.
I know.
He tells us he does it because he's anxious. We've tried taggy blankets, sensory tags, Velcro under his school desk, pom-pom balls for him to pull at, and nothing is helping. Is there anything we're missing that could help? He is also grinding like crazy and refuses to use a Chewy.
Okay. So I'm trying to think. So when you're talking about grinding, a lot of times vibration can match the grinding. So grinding is really a form of deep pressure and vestibular input, because you have so many joints and muscles that go right through your face in here. So if you can get input in there, so some kids will use the thenar muscle here in their hands and just like press in and kind of do this kind of thing. And so that can help with that input, that vibrating toothbrush. I'm not sure how old they are, but even just having the vibration or something like that in their hands sometimes can just help with that need. So when you're talking about, to switch a little bit, so when you're talking about pulling threads and things like that, a lot of times that's almost like a tick, and that's that behavior. And so I see what you're doing when you're trying to kind of replace the behavior with something else, but maybe backing that up and then trying to like maybe do some deep pressure. So if they're anxious, let's work on the anxiety piece. Like, what can we do that will be calming to their whole body? So then maybe he won't feel that need to pick and pull and have that behavioral outcome. It sounds like he's really trying to stay in control of himself by doing that. I mean, visually, it's satisfying. You kind of see the things unraveling. So just kind of looking into, what else can you do throughout the day that might kind of reduce that anxiety, or teach like some different breathing, or I don't know. Hopefully that's a little helpful. But we don't always.
Do you want to take the next one, Nicole?
Yeah, my 3-year-old is very sensory seeking. Lately, she lays on the floor, wraps one leg over the other, and rocks holding her breath. She used to only do this to help herself fall asleep, and now she does it in front of other people in the middle of the floor. She did it today at my gym, which is a child gymnastics type class. Any ideas on how to stop her from doing this? should I stop her from doing this? I just don't want her doing it when she starts school, dirty floors, and kids laughing at her.
Okay, that's my thinking face.
It's a good thinking face.
Thanks. I mean, my guess would be that if, so if she's wrapping one leg over the other, so then she's getting that compression through the knees and the hips.
It's really amazing how these kids like figure it out, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing is
like doing it for them. They're like, this works for me.
They're for sure trying to meet their needs. They're telling you what they need. We just need to find a more functional way to get it.
Yeah.
And then once we can figure that out, then back up and figure out how can we do it in a way that doesn't interfere with going to the gym. You know what I mean? So they can still do their life.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at that large muscle contraction and then the compression on probably the hips and knees. So I'd say maybe, trying, I don't know, maybe find some jumping exercises. If they're doing it more often,
And the breath holding.
Yeah, the breath holding too is that's something like, people do for sensory too, that it really puts a lot of pressure in your head and in your lungs. Like you're getting so much feedback from doing that. Like I've had kids do that to the point where they pass out because they're just like it is such a powerful inside, like reverse compression kind of thing. But at 3, you're also looking at that developmental level of they're getting a little more independent and they're trying to explore the world. So they might be a little more, that fight or flight may be kicking in at a little bit of a higher level. So again, I would say just as much as you can offer an alternative or a functional way you can get that need met. So like I said, like I'm thinking jumping or, so she's in a gymnastics class.
Have you heard of my gym? It's like a toddler gymnastics or like a gym, like a mini gym. They have usually toddlers.
So maybe anything with kind of resistance, like a resistance band on the leg of a chair where she'd get to pull and push, kind of do that kind of compression.
Class, right? Because the mom's concerned about when she starts school.
Yeah.
Those bands you're talking about that go on the bottom of the.
Yeah. So usually it's like when people exercise, they wrap them around their thighs and they do that kind of thing. I don't do that.
We found something for Nathan at one point because we homeschool, right? And so we were trying to find these non-traditional ways of sitting down because sitting is terribly hard. It's just so hard and stagnant that he can't do it. He's very much a seeker. And so we actually found an exercise ball that sat in kind of like this donut thing, but attached to the donut thing was like resistance bands. So he could sit on the ball and bounce, but at the same time kind of pull on these bands. And that was really, really helpful for him.
And so when you ask, like, should I stop her from doing this? Most of the time when kids are in the middle of a sensory seeking thing, it's very hard to get them to stop. So we want to help them find more appropriate times and ways they can get it done. So if they might do it during certain, like they're doing it at the gym every time, maybe before you go to the gym or whatever, try to find another activity to kind of replace that.
She's concerned about school and floors. My son still has, I think, a little section of the class that's like safe for him to, speaking of a safe space, like it's clean, it's got a lot of his stuff in there, and he could do what he needs in that space, and it's a safer space for him. So as the daughter gets older,
yeah. And as they get older, like if you've interrupted the habit enough, then it may not carry over because there's a huge difference between 3 to 4 to 5 in that cognitive level. And especially with girls tend to be a little more socially aware and care a little bit more if they're standing out at those ages. So sometimes that's helpful, using their brains against them.
Michelle, you want to take the next one?
Yeah. So what are we Mora's?
Yeah.
My son had written into his IEP in 5th grade that he needed to be excused from class every 30 minutes to get proprioceptive input. Sometimes he did push-ups, sometimes he would be released before recess so he could bounce a ball around the yard for 5 minutes before the other kids came out. We had the best OT and it helped so much.
Well, yay. I'm glad you got OT.
I might steal
Good people.
This is really good.
I think that's a big hard part of us, yes, is that a lot of the times, and we've talked about this before, is that we often cannot get services because we don't have, that we know there's a cognitive piece that comes with SDS, but we don't, there's no label for it. And so unless they get the other diagnosis,
it's not always there.
Right.
Yeah, it's not there. So then it's hard to justify that you need those, even though they can see that you need this. And then it becomes a hands tied kind of thing. And so I think
the symptoms.
I mean, obviously having you around has helped me kind of implement a lot of the same OT into my own house, and then I can help other people. And I don't know. I feel like you should probably bring back your Mommy's Got a Megaphone segment where you just megaphone OT exercises for everybody, and I think that would be really helpful.
So I do want to comment too, though, on this, when you're saying, that he's getting every 30 minutes he's going out, that's offering that opportunity for him to create that new neural habit of his body's coming down. And so they'll be able to fade those breaks out, and then he'll be able to stay in class longer and longer. So that's the goal. When you have those frequent breaks, it's awesome. Like, he gets to go out, he gets to get what he needs, he can come back and he can learn. And that is always the goal. And I will say too that sensory processing is the one thing I will recommend to parents to go ahead and Google it. Because there's a million ideas, there's a million resources out there. I can never say what's for sure going to work for any kid. So the best people to practice and experiment with the kid is usually their parents. So, you can find some things and say, will this work for my kid? I don't know. Let's try it, and try to go about it the best. It's easiest, like Michelle knows, when you have an OT to say, I'm going to try this. Can we monitor this together? That's always the best way to do it, but that's not always an option. But I would say,
or when like an Amazon box shows up with a gigantic squeezy inflatable huggy chair that just like rocks back and forth, and your sister's like, I got this for you to shove your kids in. I'm like, thanks. Figure out how this works now.
It's the Huggable. It's a hug boat. It's like this big inflatable thing, and your kids can get in it. So if you have kids that don't want to be touched or that you need them to work, they just squeeze. You can get it. You get it on Amazon. It's like $60. It's not like terrible.
I have this already. It was. I bought it for concerts, but I never used it. But I didn't think to use it for this. This was a really great show. Okay, I have to give you the biggest compliment. The best shows are the shows that Michelle's like, what's she gonna say? I feel
I'm just waiting. You never know. You never know.
After listening to this show, because our most watched shows are the neuro stuff, because we all struggle with this stuff day to day. Well, I can't wait to have.
And a lot of the times, especially with sensory stuff, we might not realize that's what we're seeing. So if we see a kid holding their breath, they might just look defiant, or they might just look like they're out to get attention, where it's not that at all. It's that the macaroni was a different shape and no one would listen to me.
And that macaroni is a spider, man, and I'm not putting it in my mouth.
All of us are so overwhelmed with blood and pancreas stuff and all of that. And we're taught that to, punish or whatever, like, why are you being defiant? They're being defiant because it's fight or flight. This is a great show.
Pro tip: if your kid finds the macaroni they like, keep that box. Don't throw the box away. Just find the similar shapes and put it in the box, because it's as much textural as it is visual. It's almost 50-50. Like, see the box, different color. Nope, not touch it. Could be the same brand of everything. My kids can read the box.
And Michelle, we also do grading. So you have the macaroni they're used to with the cheese they're used to, and maybe the macaroni they're used to with just butter. So you just change it a little. You just change it a little bit. And then maybe next time you have the sauce they're used to with the macaroni they're used to. So it's always just little baby changes.
Grading.
Look, you didn't die.
As always, if anyone is watching this on the replay, if you have any questions, please let us know. Sonya is Michelle's sister. We can easily get in touch with her to get those answers.
I know how to find her in like 4 seconds. It'll be fine.
I might not answer.
Thank you so much.
She probably won't.
And thank you so much, Greg,
It's
for
okay.
behind the scenes tech. He's so great at this, and we're so thankful. And these shows are getting easier and easier. And if you have any show ideas, we're in 2022, and we'd love your ideas to start picking more shows. So thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. If you have not already done so, please join the SDS registry. This information is critical for us because we're all stronger together, and none of us will understand anything if we don't understand it collectively. So everyone be safe. Wash your hands. Just wash your hands some more. Maybe stay inside, build a snowman, get some hot cocoa, and have a good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.